I'm going to, my favorite thing to do is to really look back at history as a way of thinking about the present and future. So that's, in a nutshell, what I'm going to do. I want to just start. I'm going to give some background. Not going to dwell on this for too long. We've heard bits of it already this afternoon. And then what I want to talk about is some of my own research that I think is a bit in a different systems, but has relevance to the Adirondacks. And then I'm going to try to sort of tie all that back together. And so we saw some images from the Adirondacks at this time of European settlement, and I'll just stop right there for a moment and acknowledge that, that I'm using the term settlement to describe an era, and it's a fairly gentle term for a rather violent episode in our history in terms of both people and land. I'm going to be focusing a bit on the latter. And these pictures illustrate that. The picture on the left is river lumbering. So early on, we couldn't float hardwoods, so we had to rely on rivers to transport logs downstream. So primarily pine, where I'm from, some spruce, and certainly that would have been more of the case here. And then the other part of that story is a picture on the bottom right, which is the Hinckley, Minnesota fire, the most destructive fire in history, in Minnesota's history, in terms of human lives in 1894. It also burned and killed people in Wisconsin. The important part of these two things is that in our minds, they're inextricably linked, right? So we think of the logging, we've heard a lot of reference to the residue left behind from the logging, the slash in the woods, fueling these big fires, and really it was an anomaly, and that it was driven by these massive land use changes. I've made kind of a truncated list of some of the more important, more destructive fires here on the bottom left. You'll recognize some of those dates. We've already talked about 1908 was a big fire year in the Adirondacks. But I think the important thing there is that, these were fires, and we heard earlier on the panel that we like to think about fires as an individual thing, but they're usually scattered in both in space, certainly. So fires that were burning in the Adirondacks in 1908, we had big fires burning across many of the upper Great Lakes region as well. And here we go. You've already sort of been introduced to this, but this isn't just, what I'm talking about is not special to the upper lake states. It's widespread, and it was here. And so, what I also think is interesting is not only do we attribute these, quote, anomalous fires to slash being left in the woods, but in many cases, the wildfires were used to justify wasteful logging practices. You can find published accounts of this in Wisconsin. More, quote unquote, more timber was lost to fires than was sent to the mills. Here's a piece that I grabbed from the Adirondack Almanac that was talking about these collective fires in 03 and 08, saying that the old growth stands were not immune. And so we heard from Phil a little about this earlier, but really fire was the ultimate degradation, the ultimate degrading force. And Phil also introduced us to the Sargent report. This is a Sargent map. This was commissioned by the U.S. Census in 1880. So after the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin, 1871, that killed upwards of 1,500 people, some estimates go far above that. Most, destructive fire in history in terms of human lives. But after some of these early catastrophic fires, the government realized we had to get a handle on this problem. And so part of that was to at least identify the magnitude of the problem. So in 1880, the Sargent map was produced, it published in 84, and it really shows sort of the extent of fire at that time. And I'm not the first one to do this, but not getting that, but that's okay. So, but really what we're looking at here is the fire was not always the domain of the western United States. Look at the eastern United States. And so this is the proportion of woodlands burned in 1880. And really the white areas on this map are probably not woodlands. That's why they're not burned. So we are a fire country and a fire continent. And we had to do something about that. So I mentioned that, the map, the Sargent map, was really an effort to get a handle on the magnitude of the problem. And well before Smokey Bear, we had very targeted campaigns to snuff out woodland burning and fires as a whole. And so one of them is the Dixie Crusaders, which was funded by the American Forestry Association. And there were multiple parades that traversed back and forth, weaved across mostly the Deep South, hundreds of thousands of miles, and they handed out propaganda, handed out literature. They had psychologists on staff to help them understand why would people want to burn their woods. So it was a really targeted campaign to eliminate this. And they're showing, picture movies to communities that probably in many cases hadn't even heard of radio yet in the mid-20s, late 20s. And so it's estimated that from 1925 to 1965, the Southeast had 21 million acres a year burning to less than 600,000 acres a year. And so it was effective. And it wasn't just the Southeast where this was effective. The graph is produced by Greg Nowacki and Mark Abrams of the precipitous decline in acres burned in the eastern United States. But what I think is really important, if you think about forestry and maybe even conservation as a whole, it is rooted in, before anything else, in two things: fire suppression and then following tree planting. So fire suppression, our earliest laws in the country, some of them, were geared towards slash disposal and regulating this problem of slash in the woods. We had the 1911 Weeks Act, which did a lot of amazing things for conservation, set up cooperative fire districts. The 1924 Clark-McNeary Act basically set up that as a state you weren't to receive federal funding if you didn't have an active fire suppression program. So there was really an organized attempt to eliminate that. Fire suppression was conservation, and tree planting followed with successional theory sort of underpinning all that. Fast forward to the present, and this really is kind of getting at what we're all here to talk about and think about, is that, forestry as a sort of discipline or a field, we can no longer afford to just hang our hat on effective fire suppression. In the era of climate change, we have to reconcile some really tough things right now as a community. And so this is a pie graph. It's a data collected by the Forest Stewards Guild, which, admittedly, maybe they're not targeting, the average logger necessarily or logging community, but it was a really well done survey of loggers pretty much across the country. And what I find so impressive by this is, like, if you look at the labels on those pie pieces, we wouldn't see those labels 10 years ago, probably. The other thing I'll point out is that really to be able to do this, to be able to improve resilience of forest threats, reduce wildfire threats, sequester carbon, to do any of these things well, I think we have to have an understanding of disturbance ecology. And so, what does that look like? And so this is a map. The map I'm showing you is land fire data. It's a big model and mapping exercise, pretty much wall to wall across the country, and a lot of it's really getting after this idea of fire risk and fire hazard. But this is the historical fire regimes according to state-of-the-art models, state-of-the-art, expert opinion, the data, the published literature, et cetera. And so what you see is, like, they have these broken down into fire regime groups, right? So we here, where we are in the Adirondacks, and if you look across northern Wisconsin and northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, it's pretty much the same. We're fire regime group 5. We have very low frequency and very high severity. Stand replacing fire is what we're characterized as, by and large, at a broad scale. There's exceptions to that. But it says 200 plus year fire frequency. So in northern Wisconsin, just so we're on the same page, we too view ourselves in most places as the maple-dominated northern hardwoods broad hat, quote-unquote asbestos forest. So we share similarities there. And so the quote, maybe some of you have heard of Derek Churchill or Andrew Larson. They're students of Jerry Franklin, who's sort of the guru in the Pacific Northwest. Jerry has produced a ton of really cool work and a lot of really great students doing cool things. But the quote is that To increase resilience, we need to restore the range of patterns found in forests with intact disturbance regimes. So, Nicole earlier mentioned that I think she had a degree or part of her program was ecological forestry. We have whole systems of forestry now, at least in label, that are directed towards this exact concept. That's, trying to emulate natural disturbances in terms of our management of forests, so turning it into silvicultural regimes, et cetera. And so the pictures here, in Wisconsin, we tend to manage, where we have pine stands, we tend to manage them just like the map. That is, we basically thin them maybe, and then we harvest them, we herbicide, we replant, and then they grow until they're merchantable or harvestable age again. So it's basically the equivalent of low frequency, high severity fire regime. So it's no different than sort of we think about the natural regime. And I should say we manage natural origin red pine exactly the same way. So it's yield-based thinning, maximizing space for each growing individual, and then we slick it off and start over. And maybe that's in line with what the natural fire regime would have been. But that's where my work comes in. So one of the fancy titles I wear is dendrochronologist. So dendro is tree, chronology is the study of time. Basically, I'm a nerd for tree rings is what that means. And so I've got, we talked, I think Jade earlier showed a picture of a fire scar. These are pictures, one of them I stole from Emily Heyerdahl. But essentially these, like red pine, just like they are in the Adirondacks, are not, generally large, widespread, homogeneous stands. They're sprinkled around. You might find a knoll that's more dominated by them, but we have red pine just like you do, and we have white pine just like you do. And red pine are very adept to surviving fire. They have thick bark, so the growing tissue of a red pine, or in Emily's case, a ponderosa pine, might get scorched enough to create an injury, and that tree tries to heal over it. And once it's injured, it's really easy to re-injure. So they're great recorders of individual fire events over long periods of time. And so, and we use dendrochronology, with the fancy word comes into the dating of these things. So we learn narrow drought years through many, many centuries. I have a chronology, fire and tree ring chronology for the Midwest now going back to 1321. So long records with detailed information. And so I can't get this pointer to work for some reason. Oh, maybe I am. So this tree right here that I'm cutting on, I'll take a partial section. I won't fell the tree. But most of those, quote, cat faces that Jade talked about, they look like this now. So those are, in some cases, they're now hardwood forests without a pine tree in sight, but the remnants of the original forest are still there 100 and sometimes 50 years after they were harvested. And so I've collected data, thousands of these fire-scarred samples all over Michigan and Wisconsin, but I'm going to really focus on a subset, 8 of these sites, at least initially, that I want to show you some interesting data from. And so I don't want to scare you off with charts and data and graphs. I just want you to understand a couple of things. So right here, we have what we call a fire history diagram. So each one of these horizontal lines is an individual sample. This was a stump with an outer date somewhere around 1830 or 40. A couple of these trees were recently dead or living trees that we were able to take samples from, but by and large, these are all stumps that we were able to date, and each one of these inverted triangles is now a fire date. And the important part of this is that these dates on the bottom, this is our composite fire chronology. So what we can do is we can say, show me the fires that occur where we have at least 2 trees recording fire, and the dates that show up on 10, 15, 20% of our samples. So we can filter for larger, more ecologically significant fires, if you will. And then the bottom part of this is tree recruitment. Oops, and I don't know why it did that. Bumped the T, but so I've got it. Red pine is Pinus resinosa, pyri, pist is white pine, and then deciduous is lumped. And so these are tree births over time, right? And so this kind of data is the exact kind of data we collected for all of these sites. This is, again, I'll remind you, this is the northern hardwood dominated system generally. This particular graphs are for Togatic, but we've basically found mean fire return interval. The average number of years between fires ranged between 6 and 13 years for these sites. We found in almost all cases, they were not simple, single age, single cohort stands, but these are, continual recruitment. We found that today, forests are up to 37 times more dense, on average 12, than they were approximately 1860. And then, what I think is really cool, is the spatial patterning of these stands. Sometimes these are some of our nicest stands in Wisconsin. Really doesn't resemble what it would have looked like in 1860, where they would have been clumpy groupy and really spatially complex and heterogeneous. And today, they're sort of, completely spatially random. They're just, they're quite different that way. And so that's the sort of data we collected on all those sites. So really what I just showed you is exactly the opposite, 180 degrees different than the way we imagine these systems working. Punctuated mortality, wind throw, severe fire, punctuated recruitment, a simple even age cohort develops, blah, blah, blah. That is not the way that these systems worked. But that's the way we manage them, and that's the way we conceptualize it, and that is the way we think about them, and still do today. It's work like this where we're beginning to upset this and say, wait a minute, right? So now I want to talk about big fires. So what I've done here now, I hope you can recall what the composite is. So I took, now one line is a site. So that site you just looked at was Togatik River. Now it's one line, and I said, show me the biggest fires, maybe the 12 biggest fires that occurred in that site. And I took 30 samples into one line, and I did that for all 8 sites. Now these dates are composited to say, show me the fires that occurred in multiple ecological landscapes, numerous sites that burned. So these are probably fires that burned hundreds of thousands of acres. These are big fires, like 1908 here. So, that's to understand that. And so a few of these fire dates we can corroborate with other evidence. So 1910 was a continental scale drought year. 1910 was the largest fire year known in the Northern Rockies. That's where Ed Pulaski held his men down by gunpoint in a mine shaft and saved their lives. That's the fire that Stephen Pine and others have written about that set the course for the Forest Service to the present. So 1910 was a huge fire year, and it was a big fire year in the Midwest as well. 1871 and 1780 are also interesting. I was really interested to hear somebody talk about the Dark Day of New England, 1780. This was one of those fires that, we find tree ring evidence for it in all over the Midwest and all over southern Canada. And it was this particularly interesting year because the weather conditions were such that the sun was blotted out in the middle of the day, and people on the eastern seaboard didn't know what to make of that. They literally thought it was the second coming of Christ. Chickens were going to roost at noon, things like that. And so there's tons of fire scar evidence for it. And I should say that, when we have evidence of a fire from a fire scar, that's a tree that lived through that fire. So that's an important nuance to make. But I'll get back to that point in terms of severity of fire in a moment. But so anyway, 1780 was interesting also because it was a spring fire. Most of the years that I've talked about, most of the years that I will talk about, are summer and fall fires. Big fires were predominantly summer and fall. And so the 1871 Peshtigo fire, since it killed 1,500 people in Wisconsin, we get the naming rights, right? So generally that's how it works. So just like Minnesota gets the Hinckley fire, even though it killed people in Wisconsin in 1894. But what's interesting about the Peshtigo fire is that, one, it was in October 8, 1871. It was, again, the second year of a prolonged, really pretty decent drought. It burned probably twice as many acres in Michigan, but again, we get the naming rights. But what I think is most interesting about the Peshtigo fire is when I went to the Peshtigo Fire Museum and I found this map. You really have to push this sucker. So it's hard to make out, but this is what is now the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin, which is actually a really cool block of land. It's an entire county. And today we have Marinette County and here and Oconto County. And this whole area that you're looking at is the burnt district of 1871. Typically, we only think of the high severity portion of this fire, which is 1.2 million acres. And so where we're finding fire scar evidence of this low severity fire that left trees alive is in all this country. right here, and not in this other footprint. And there's a reason for that. And I got interested in this because of the place names on this map. So this map is showing you the 1.2 million acres of high severity fire, and it's got names like the upper, middle, and lower Sugar Bush and Birch Creek. And so I got curious about that because, one, I've driven through that land and I know what it looks like today. There's practically no pine in it whatsoever. And that's exactly right. So I took the General Land Office Original Land Survey witness trees. So when we divided up the country into township, range, and section, we basically took witness tree records of all these section corners and things like that. So in that 1.2 million acres, we have 11,000 witness trees. And I just graphed them. And the number one species found in that landscape is hemlock, followed by cedar, beech, tamarack, sugar maple, white pine. There's more black ash in this landscape than there is pine. So this is a mesic landscape. This is where the people died. So I think this is really interesting, right? We have a low severity fire that burned twice as many acres and killed nobody, and we've forgotten about it. And we have a high severity fire that killed lots of people, and we blame it on pine slash. And that last point is important because there is no pine slash. There's no pine here. They weren't logging pine in these woods. In 1871, the railroad had not connected to Green Bay. We were still river lumbering. There was no pine slash in basically the footprint of the high severity portion of this fire. And so what this brings me to is I have to ask, are we asking the right questions? Have we been intellectually curious about this really dramatic period of history? And I would say uniformly no. And so the Miramichi fire was one of the largest fire years known in 1825 in Maine. And this fire, it's fascinating. You read about it. So it burned in New Brunswick and it burned in Maine in 1825. 1825, by the way, again, October 7, one day different than the October 8th Peshtigo fire. So again, going back to that point of seasonality of fires, which I think is fascinating. So 1825 was one of the hottest summers in the 19th century. So that is the context. There were hundreds of fires burning in 1825 across a huge geographical area, including Canada, including the developing East Coast. And what's fascinating to me is the history about this fire, or these fires, tends to focus on it as a single event, and whether it was a single event or two events, because it also happened in New Brunswick, and who has the naming rights, and has one story been eclipsed by the other. And it's just a weird way of thinking about a epic fire year that burned huge amount of area. And again, Maine was at, this part of Maine that was burning in 1825 was at the edge of the frontier. So logging, wholesale logging probably wasn't part of the picture. It certainly wasn't part of the picture in New Brunswick because it was basically unpopulated. So, and again, if you read about this fire, you will read the same exact players, the usual suspects: logging slash, sparks from trains, settlement, the same factors. And I think it's just amazing, actually. And so just to sort of kick a dead horse for a second here, right? So I've talked about these 8 sites in Wisconsin and whatever, but I also want to talk about the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And this is the quote-unquote asbestos forest, but there's a lot of interesting pieces that go into sort of the big hat of northern hardwoods, or whatever we want to call them, mixed woods. So, and the central part of the Upper Peninsula is really big wetlands, huge peatland complexes. And again, I'm sorry that the formatting got kind of messed up on some of these, but and then, so we compiled a massive data set with a bunch of different researchers, tree ring-based fire history studies. So we have, these giant peatland complexes where we established fire history. We have these big northern hardwood landscapes like the Huron Mountains or the Sturgeon River Gorge Wilderness. We have coastal Lake Superior sand plains, et cetera. And so in all these cases, we did find evidence of relatively frequent low-severity fires. So that's one thing. And what we were really interested in when we mashed all these big data sets together was, what about the size? What about the synchrony of these events? Were peatlands burning at the same time as these giant northern hardwood landscapes? Can we link them together? What were these fire years like? And so these fires that are listed, we established big fires in a few different ways. But we filtered. We said, show me the biggest fires in a site, and then we compiled them, which ones are synchronous among sites, and then we came up with a fire extent index, which is sort of calibrated for sample size. So we evaluated this in multiple ways. And what we find is that synchronous fires across many different systems across the entire Upper Peninsula of Michigan were not uncommon. And you're looking at some of those dates there. 1791 shows up in New Brunswick. I mean, these are big fire years. These are widespread droughts. And so this is what that data is showing us, the climate. So now we've graphed the actual messy Palmer Drought Severity Index and plotted the big fire years, the biggest known fire years across the Upper Peninsula. And then this is our statistical test. We basically said, you know, what was the climate on all these fire years, year 0, and then how about the climate, the Palmer Drought Severity Index the year before the fires, et cetera, and year after. And then we randomly chose fire years with 1,000 iterations to create confidence intervals. Anyways, that's the nerdy statistical way of looking at this data, saying that it was significantly dry on all these big, widespread fire years, which were relatively common across, you know what's coming, right? The asbestos forest. Okay, so we've also talked about this a little bit as a group, right? So what happened? We've enjoyed this, you know, tranquil period in the Adirondacks with no fires. I mean, is it luck? Is it climate? Is it, you know, fragmentation? And I would say yes, yes, and yes, right? It's all these things. Like, so we, you know, aspen can burn, but it sure doesn't burn as easily as some other forest types. So we had basically leveled our forests and replaced them with a relatively young, dominated by more aspen and other hardwood forests. So that's one factor. Mesification, right? We have more red maple and more sugar maple, and their leaves hold more moisture and they don't burn as well. That's true. We don't have indigenous ignition. That's true. We have active fire suppression. We have fuel breaks. But what we tend to focus on almost least in all these things is climate. But I am glad that we're now being forced to reckon with this, and we should, because there's important things to learn. So I'm almost done with the super nerdy stuff, but I want to show you one more little bit of data. So now I talked about compiling a big data set for the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I worked with colleagues in Quebec, all over the country, and we compiled a massive database of tree ring-based fire history studies. And each one of those dots represents numerous sites in many cases, because sites had to be more than 40 kilometers apart to be considered their own dot. So this is a really big data set of fire history, like I've been showing you. And then we also used contemporary data, so actual empirical records of fires that have burned in, say, the last 50 years or 100 years. And so what we wanted to know was, were there fires, and what was the climate fire relationships for what we call, really active high fire activity years. And so this is, what I'm showing you now this is climate data. So some of you have probably heard of El Nino or La Nina, the El Nino Southern Oscillation climate phenomena. It's particularly strong in, say, the west coast of the United States, but it can have climatic influences here too. And then there's the Pacific North American pattern as well. And so these are both broad-scale climate patterns that seem to have some relationship with high fire activity. And so the red is high fire activity, the blue is non-fire years, and basically the black line is sort of a trend. And so what we found was that, there was a really significant association. So somewhere around, the turn of the century, 1930 or so, we had this relatively quiet period of time in terms of high fire activity, and that seems to be ramping up now in recent years. And so there is sort of a climate pattern that could explain some of our luck in fighting fires. And I should also point out that when we looked at that at a finer scale, there was a strong influence of summer and fall fires with high fire activity, high fire states. Okay, so I've thrown a bunch of data at you. I've bombarded you with Wisconsin and Michigan and whatever. So what does it mean? What does it mean in terms of systems? What does it mean in terms of the Adirondacks, where we're going, what we're thinking about? And I don't even hardly need to state this now because we've done such a good job of recognizing the unique moment of time that we're in. But we did have a 2,000-mile long smoke plume that crossed the Atlantic Ocean a few years ago. And if that wasn't a wake-up call, then maybe the high fire activity year in 2024 was, primarily again in summer and fall, or maybe even what's shaping up right now in parts of our country. But I think that at a 10,000 foot level, this is the theme that we're here to address. It's happened. Can it again? I think we would be almost naive to think it couldn't happen again. And it's happening all around us. And I think it's really important. What's fascinating to me is in 2023, a lot of the media attention was focused on the really prolonged drought in New Brunswick and BC and Western Canada. But actually in 2023, Eastern Canada, just like Wisconsin, came out of a very wet winter with great snow and a really wet early spring followed by an unprecedented May-June drought. It was a flash drought. It put a new words in our vernacular, flash drought. I had never talked about flash droughts until 2023. So we are entering some new period of time. And yeah, we're in it, folks. And so what is it, right? Some of you maybe have seen Robin Wall Kimmerer's beautiful little book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And we heard earlier Jade alluded to the creation story in Turtle Island. And Robin opens her book really with the creation story, talking about Sky Woman coming down to Earth through the sky. And eventually she gives birth to twin boys. And these twin boys, one of them is the creation, and one of them is destruction. And they're not thought of as good and evil. They're not thought of as sort of, they're really thought of as one giving context to the other. And you don't really, the whole picture, but they're these twin forces. And in a more recent interview, Robin says the job of humans is to understand how to keep these forces in balance, right? And so this is really fire in a nutshell. So we have these twin forces, and I've muddled those lines in the last 15 minutes or so between creation and destruction, right? We have the Peshtigo fire killed 1,500 people. We have, low severity and high severity. So I think our job now is to think about these things more as not one or the other, but both, and how do we get more of what we want? And so there are ways to do that. And, we've heard a bit about that from panels and other speakers. But again, falling back on Derek Churchill, this is where my research is going right now. I'm borrowing concepts really from the Western United States. But what we're learning from Jerry Franklin and his lab is that complexity is so important. And we heard about the worries about salvage logging. And I'm almost done. Is that my time cue right there that kicked me off? So just real briefly, we're learning about the importance of complexity. And this is a simple system and a simple illustration of it. But we know that taxpayer dollars are being used to create this right here, regular thinning, homogeneous, yield-based. It's our model. It's our fallback. Everything we do in forestry, our default essentially is fall. It's not everything we do, but our default is usually yield-based. And so this is the way we thin for wildfire mitigation. And what we know is that with enough wind, this forest can sustain crown fire. And what we also are learning is that a forest with more complex spatial patterning, it can't sustain crown fire. You might have torching of trees, but eventually that fire hits the ground and becomes that creative rather than destructive fire. So this is one illustration of how complexity matters and how we can be tapping that. And so I worked with, I don't know why that happened, but I worked with a postdoc and a colleague of mine, Elena Razenkova, and we went to a host of old growth stands, mixed conifer stands throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we really wanted to understand this idea of complexity. And so what we found, so this is reference data for these sites in Minnesota. The data for Wisconsin looks much the same. And so what we also did was we measured canopies of old growth pines. And by and large, the average canopy size of a forest grown old growth pine is about 6 meters. And so what you're looking at here is how many of these trees that we measured are far enough apart from other trees at 1 meter to be considered an individual. And so using that 6 meters, they're all individuals at that distance. And what we find is historically, at about 6 meters, forests had a mix of sometimes large clumps of trees, medium-sized clumps of trees, small clumps of trees, and individuals. And it varies a little by where you are, but 6 meters gives you this like really sweet spot in terms of there was really, you can see that complexity in terms of the spatial patterning. Today, and I get too messy to show all these today, but at 6 meters today, and actually most of the time at 4 meters, these charts are solid blue, one large clump. So basically in 1860, these old growth stands had really complex spatial structure. And with no fires to sort of do their shaping over time, we now see that these old growth stands are homogeneously dense and homogeneously spaced in space. And so what we think that means is that if a fire were to come into these stands today versus 1860, we would have a very different outcome. So this is a way of thinking about those twin forces of creation and destruction. We have a role to play in this with forest management. Okay, so to sort of summarize the take-home points, these are the test questions. And again, the formatting got a little mixed up. But so what I've told you is that we have this relatively narrow snapshot of time where we think of fires as bad. We organized ourselves in terms of forestry and conservation as fighting them, and we've been really slow to evolve from that. I can now look at 800 years of data for the upper lake states, and low severity, high frequency fires were regular. They were regular over hundreds and hundreds of years. And what is irregular is the last 100 years of no fire, of fire exclusion. So I think we've heard this term asbestos forest today. We love to talk about pyrophytic and pyrophobic, fire-loving and fire-hating. That is kind of, in my mind, not very productive. I think we need to retire those terms. I think all systems, or at least most, in North America, certainly in the United States, are either one of two things. They're either fire adapted or fire dependent. There is no such thing as a pyrophobic or a asbestos forest. You either had long time between fires and they could have been more high severity, or many species depend on fire, including your pines, including your oaks, including paper birch. Paper birch is a fire dependent species. And I actually would extend that list. I'm now doing research on hemlock and yellow birch, but anyways, I think it's silly to talk about our forests as asbestos, and I think maybe even that could be carried to a scale of a tree or a species. And these, fires, low severity fires maintain complexity. It was fires, it was wind throw, it was this messiness, these disturbances in our forests that made them messy and beautiful and wonderful, and that actually has a role in protecting them as well. And so if nothing else, if you forget everything I said, remember this last point. We need to be more curious about our recent history than just to attribute all things that the cutover took decades. We went after the easy to get pine along rivers, then we went further in, and then we developed rail, and we second cut the pines, and then we went after hardwoods, and eventually hemlock for tanning became useful to us. So we're talking about this long period of time, different forests, different stands. So we just have to be more curious about that time period in my mind. But thank you.